am reading Erskine Caldwell's short story, My Old Man and the Grass Widow. This is just for listening, so please excuse this ugly scene here. When my old man got up earlier than usual and left the house, he did not say where he was going, and Ma was so busy getting ready to do the washing, she did not think to ask him. Usually, when he went off like that and Ma asked him where he was going, he would say he had to see somebody about something on the other side of town, or that he had a little job to attend to not far off. I don't know what he would have said that morning if Ma hadn't been too busy to ask him. Anyway, he got up before anybody else and went straight to the kitchen and cooked his own breakfast. By the time I was up and dressed, he had finished hitching Ida to the cart. He climbed up on the seat and started driving out into the street. "Can't I go, Pa?" I asked him. I ran down the street beside the cart, holding on to the sideboard and begging to go along. "Please let me go, Pa," I said. "Not now, son," he said, slapping Ida with the reins and whipping her into a trot. "If I need you later, I'll send for you." They clattered down the street and turned the corner out. Next page. Turned the corner out of sight. When he got back to the house, Ma was in the kitchen working over the cook stove. I sat down and waited for something to eat, but I did not say anything about Pa. It made me feel sad to be left behind like that when Pa and Ida were going someplace, and I didn't feel like talking, even to Ma. I just sat at the table by the stove and waited. Ma ate in a hurry and went out into the yard to kindle the fire underneath the washpot. Early that afternoon, one of the neighbors, Mrs. Singer, who lived on the corner below us, came walking into our backyard. I saw her before Ma did, because I had been sitting on the porch steps almost all day waiting for Pa to come back. Mrs. Singer went over to the bench where Ma was washing. She stood and didn't say anything for a while. Then, all at once, she leaned over the tub and asked Ma if she knew where Pa was. Let me do that last sentence again. Then, all at once, she leaned over the tub and asked if she knew where Pa was. "Most likely sleeping in the shade somewhere," Ma said, not even straightening up from the scrub board, unless he was too lazy to move out of the sun. "I'm in dead earnest, Martha," Mrs. Singer said, coming closer to Ma. "I really am." Ma turned around and looked at me on the porch. "Run along into the house, William," she said crossly. I went up on the porch as far as the kitchen door. I could hear there just as good. "Now, Martha," Mrs. Singer said, leaning over and putting her hands on the edge of the tub, "I'm not a gossip, and I don't want you to think I'm anything like one, but I thought you'd want to hear the truth. I thought you would want to hear the truth." "What is it?" Ma asked. "Mr. Stroop is out at that Mrs. Weatherby's this very minute," she said quickly. "And that's not all either. He's been out there at her house all day long. Just him and her." "How do you know?" Ma asked, straightening up. "I passed there and saw him with my own eyes, Martha," Mrs. Singer said. "I decided right then and there that it was my duty to tell you." Mrs. Weatherby was a young grass widow who lived all alone just outside of town. She had been married for only 2 months when her husband left her one morning and never came back. What is Morris Stroop doing out there at that place?" Ma said, raising her voice just as she were blaming everything on Mrs. Singer. "That's not for me to say, Martha," she said, backing away from Ma, "but I considered it my Christian duty to warn you." She left the house and hurried out of sight around the corner of the house. Ma leaned over and sloshed the water in the tub until a lot of it splashed out. After a minute or two, she turned around and started across the yard, drying her hands on her apron as she went. "William," she said, calling me. "William," she said, calling me. "You go inside the house and stay there until I come back. I want to think you are obeying me, William. Do you hear me, William?" "I hear you, Ma," I said, backing toward the door. She walked out of the yard in a hurry and went up the street. That was the direction to take to get to Mrs. Weatherby's house. She lived about 3/4 of a mile from where we did. I stood on the back porch out of sight until Ma crossed the street at the next corner, and then I ran around the house and cut across Mr. Joe Hammond's vacant lot. toward the creek. I knew a shortcut to Mrs. Weatherby's house because I had... Just a minute. Hello. You guys are being noisy. I can't read if you're being noisy. I stood on the back porch out of sight until Ma crossed the street at the next corner, and then I ran around the house and cut across Mr. Joe Hammond's vacant lot toward the creek. I knew a shortcut to Mrs. Weatherby's house because I had passed it. I had passed by it a lot of times going rabbit hunting with Handsome Brown. Handsome had always said it was a good idea to know shortcuts to every place because there was no telling when one would come in handy, just when it was needed the most. I was glad I knew a shortcut to Mrs. Weatherby's because Ma would have seen me if I had gone behind her. I ran all the way out there, keeping close to the willows along the creek, just like Handsome and I had done every time we went out there looking for rabbits. Just before I got to Mrs. Weatherby's house, I stopped and looked around for Pa. I couldn't see him anywhere about Mrs. Weatherby's house. I couldn't even see her. Then I crossed the creek and ran up the lane toward the house, keeping close to the fence that was covered over with honeysuckle vines. Didn't take long to get as far as the garden, and as soon as I looked around the corner post, I saw Ida standing at the garden gate. All she was doing was standing there switching flies with her tail. I think she might have recognized me right away because she pricked up both ears and held them straight up in the air while she watched me. I had started crawling around the garden fence when I looked across Mrs. Weatherby's backyard and saw Mom coming jumping. She was leaping over the cotton rows headed straight for the backyard. Just then, I heard Mrs. Weatherby's giggle. I looked toward the house, and I didn't even have to get up off my knees to see her and my old man. Mrs. Weatherby kept it up, giggling as if she were out of her head, just exactly like the girls at school did when they knew a secret about something. At first, all I could see was Mrs. Weatherby's bare legs and feet dangling over the side of the porch. Then I saw my old man standing on the ground, tickling her with a chicken feather. Mrs. Weatherby was lying on her back on the porch, and she was standing there tickling her bare toes, and he was standing there tickling her bare toes for all he was worth. Every once in a while he would sort of leap off the ground when she giggled the loudest. She had taken off her shoes and stockings, because I could see them in a heap on the porch. Mrs. Weatherby was not old like the other married women, because she had been going to high school in town when she got married that spring, and she had been a grass widow for only 3 or 4 months. She lay there on the porch, squirming on her back, kicking her feet over the edge, and screaming and giggling like she was going to die if my old man didn't stop tickling her with the chicken feather. Every once in a while, she would laugh as loud as she could, and that made everything funnier than ever, because when she did that, my old man would leap up into the air like a kangaroo. I had forgotten all about Ma because I was so busy listening to Mrs. Weatherby and watching my old man. But just then I looked across the yard and saw Ma coming. She made straight for the porch where they were. Everything happened so fast from then on that it was hard to follow what was taking place. The first thing I knew after that was when Ma grabbed my old man by the hair on his head and slung him backwards, clear off his feet. Then she grabbed one of Mrs. Weatherby's bare feet and bit it as hard as she could. Mrs. Weatherby let out a scream that must have been heard all the way to Sycamore. Mrs. Weatherby sat up then, and Ma grabbed at her, getting a good grip on the neck of her calico dress. It ripped away from her just like a piece of loose wallpaper. Mrs. Weatherby screamed again when she saw her dress go. By that time, Ma had turned on my old man. He was sitting on the ground, too scared to move an inch. "What do you mean by this, Morris Scroop?" she yelled at him. "Why, Martha, I only just came out here to do a good deed for a poor widow woman," he said, looking up at Ma the way he does when he's scared. "Her garden sass needed cultivating, and so I just hitched up Ida and came out here to plow it a little for her." Ma whirled around and grabbed at Mrs. Weatherby again. This time, the only way she could get a grip on Mrs. Weatherby was to clutch her by the hair. "I reckon, Morris Scroop," Ma said, turning her head and looking down at my old man, "that tickling a grass widow's toes with a chicken feather makes the garden sass grow better." Now, Martha, he said, sliding backward on the ground away from her, I didn't think of it that way at all. I just wanted to do the widow woman a kindly deed when I saw her sass growing weedy. Shut up, Morris Stroop, Ma said. The next thing you'll be doing will be putting the blame on Ida. Now, Martha, my old man said, sliding away some more on the seat of his pants, that ain't no way to look at things. She's a poor widow woman. I'll look at it the way I please, Ma said, stamping her foot. I have to go out and strip the leaves off milkweeds for enough food to keep body and soul together while you go around the country with a mule and plow, cultivating grass widows' gardens. Not to mention tickling their bare toes with chicken feathers besides. That's a pretty howdy-do. My old man opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something, but Ma turned Mrs. Weatherby loose and grabbed him by his overall straps before he could speak a single word. Then she led him at a fast pace to the garden post where Ida was tied up. She took Ida by the bridle with one hand, still pulling my old man with the other, and started across the cotton field toward home. Ida knew something was wrong because she trotted to keep up with Ma without being noticed. I raced down the lane to the creek and hurried home by the shortcut. I got there only a minute ahead of them. When Ma came into our backyard leading Ida and my old man, I couldn't keep from snickering a little by the way both of them looked. Ida looked every bit as sheepish as my old man. Ma glanced at me, standing on the porch. Stop that going on, William, she said crossly. Sometimes I think you're just as bad as your pa. My old man cut his eyes around and looked up at me. He winked with his right eye and went across the yard to Ida's stall, following Ma as meek as a pup. Just before they went into the shed, my old man stooped down and picked up a chicken feather with one of the hens had shed. While Ma was leading Ida inside, he stuffed the feather into his pocket, out of sight. The end.